The Bible is full of so many interesting stories, and many of us know some of the more popular ones, like David and Goliath and Noah and his ark. But comprising 66 different books, the Bible has so many different stories that many of us don't know about. And today we're going to talk about one of the strangest stories in the Bible.
This is 21st Talks. My name is Vince, and I'm here with Phil. And today's topic is God arbitrary? Decoding strange stories in the Bible.
Before we begin, we'd like to give a huge shout out to all of our supporters around the world, particularly Mike in Paris, who sent us several voice messages on anchor.fm/21sttalks. Thank you for your appreciation and love, bro. Also, Dave Noel, my cousin in Fort Lauderdale, thank you not only for commenting and supporting, but giving us feedback. We appreciate it. And thank you for Jay Rosario, who shared a link to our episode on multiple social media platforms. Brother, we love you. Thank you for the support. And if you'd like to get a personal shout out, be sure to comment, engage with us, just say hi, and we'll be sure to show our appreciation.
All right, Phil, let's get started. It's an interesting story, and as I was saying before, it's about Elisha, 2 bears, and 42 children. This story is found in 2 Kings chapter 2, and we're going to dive right in there because it's just 2 verses. I'm going to read those 2 verses for you really quick. 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 23 and 24. There he went up from there to Bethel, and as he was going up the road, some youths came from the city and mocked him, and said unto him, Go up, thou bald head, go up, thou bald head. So he turned around and looked at them, and pronounced a curse on them in the name of the Lord. And 2 female bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the youths. That's already the story. And it sounds pretty frightening, doesn't it, Phil?
I mean, it sounds crazy. I mean, let's be honest. If I'm a skeptic, okay, if I meet a guy that's at work and I'm like, hey, you should read your Bible, whatever. He opens up the Bible to this passage and he reads about a man of God encountering some kids on a road. And because they make fun of his balding head, he curses them, and 2 she-bears come out of the wherever and devour them. How do I sell that as, hey, sign up for Christianity, come, this is the way, if you do something wrong, bears will eat you, it's what?
I know.
I don't know, man.
It's crazy, right? But you know what I think? It's not about the fact that Elisha didn't have any hair on his head. I think it's, the real problem here is that they said, go up, go up. When we think about go up, we don't really know what that means. But when we look at the context, we know that just a few verses before, Elijah, the prophet before Elisha, is taken to heaven in a chariot of fire. I mean, some of us remember that story. And so you have to know that Elijah, he left a legacy. His ministry was amazing. He was also a type for, a special people that will be, going to heaven directly without seeing death. And now Elisha comes, and he starts his ministry. So this story is at the very beginning of his ministry. And there comes a bunch of kids, right? And they say, oh, why don't you go up to heaven too, like your other guy, like Elijah, right? Go up, go to heaven, And so they insult him. And I think that's the real problem right now. And but generally speaking, I wanted to say something that kind of comments on the story. I found this comment in a book called Prophets and Kings, and it's very interesting. The author here says the following words. Had Elisha allowed the mockery to pass unnoticed, he would have continued to be ridiculed and reviled by the rabble, and his mission to instruct and save in a time of grave national peril might have been defeated. So you have to understand the context here. The context is that Israel is in a great time of peril, as the author says. And Elisha has a clear mission. And it's before that mission even starts, you got these kids, they're making fun of him. And then also, I believe there were people watching probably. There were probably, people around. And if that incident had not happened the way it happened, people would have continued to make fun of Elisha. And his mission would have maybe, failed, Phil. What do you think?
Okay, I'll give you that, right? His mission would have failed if people didn't respect him and whatnot. But I'm going to hold your feet to the fire, Vince. How does that still, it doesn't answer the question. How is this any different, than a dictator somewhere in some random far off country that goes into a village and kills everyone because their mayor, their chief or whatever doesn't support him. He's just like, hey, you're not supporting me, so I'm just going to slay you. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
so what? Yeah, if the people didn't want to follow Elisha, then the people didn't want to follow Elisha. How does that justify killing 42 people?
That's a good point, man. But I don't think the problem is with Elisha here. I think the problem is with God. I believe that Elisha was a prophet, and we know that a prophet is someone who speaks on behalf of God. So you shouldn't be asking the question, oh, this is because of Elisha. We have to talk about the character of God then. And I mean, that's a big topic. Why did God allow these things to happen? What is going on here?
Sure. I mean, one thought that I have that maybe helps us to break the issue down a little bit more. It doesn't answer it completely, but it comes in the book Spiritual Gifts. And in that book, Ellen White talks about how when the Millerites were disappointed in 1844 when Jesus didn't come back as they had expected, a lot of Christians and neighbors and people around them mocked them. And the words fell from mocking lips saying, "You have not gone up yet." Similar to what these kids were saying to Elisha, right? And what Ellen White says is that they were actually mocking God. Similar to how, what you were saying, that these kids were not just mocking Elisha, but they were actually mocking God. And I mean, for me, the personal lesson I can take from that, even though it doesn't fully answer the question, right, is there are many people in our church that have made predictions in recent years. I mean, there are people that have predicted that there's going to be an economic collapse, something big is going to happen by the end of the year. There are people that have predicted that the Sunday law is coming, by the spring and stuff like that. Like all these different, beliefs and like things that are being peddled, right?
Yeah.
Now, on one occasion, I actually reached out to one of the ladies that was, a proponent of one of these ideas. And I asked her to explain to me her reasoning. And so she was very gracious. She called me and we talked for over an hour, I believe. And she broke down, the scripture and why she felt why something was going to happen by a certain date. And although it wasn't completely clear to me and I didn't 100% agree, after reading this story, I'm happy that I didn't, mock or ridicule her or make fun of her or anything crazy like that. Because the idea is that when it comes to issues of God, especially when someone is sincere, it's important that we not mock them for being wrong because we're all fallible. So if someone has a belief or an ideology that's a little bit off or you don't agree with, for me, the takeaway from this lesson is don't make fun of them because you never know if you're actually making fun of God by making fun of them. Then you'll reap the consequences of basically mocking God.
Yeah, I mean, it's an issue of respect, right? We should have respect for one another. And I think what these children were not taught is to respect elderly people or, ministers. And that was a huge problem. And I mean, just imagine those children, they grow up. I mean, it doesn't get better, right? I mean, they don't turn 18 or 21 and then they're like, oh, but now I respect people. No. This is going to get worse and worse. So maybe in this case, and also we see that in other stories in the Bible as well, God is intervening here in a miraculous way to prevent the greater evil. That would be just looking at the life of these children and maybe, the future children that they would have, whatever, generations to come. And God says he makes a stop right there and he says, no further. This is enough, right? Enough is enough. But I mean, I was just reminded of our other episode that we had a couple weeks ago, Phil, and that is the question, should kindness have limits? We were talking about meekness. We're talking about how to be, meek to one another. This is a very extreme example because we find kids who did not know what respect means, who did not know what it means to be nice to someone, and then also on the other hand, we look at Elisha and we see that even his kindness, or can I say the kindness of God here? I don't know, had limits. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's true. It ties in perfectly to meekness versus weakness. And I think what helps that point really, in order for that point to really hold weight for me, it's important to understand the context in which the story is taking place. Israel was a theocracy. So God was their king. God told them when to go to war. God told them when to go left, when to go right. God was their leader, right? So God was the one that executed justice, capital punishment, and so on and so forth. So God is all knowing. He's all kind. He's all loving. And so if God in his wisdom decided that these kids should die, I can't question God's wisdom. Like, no court of man can come to a more just judgment than God can. So at that point, I have to say, okay, God is just, and he was king, right? God didn't necessarily impose himself on Israel. It was a mutual decision. Hey, we want you to be our king. You're our king. And that was the pact that they made, right?
Yeah.
When they left Egypt, it was like, I'm going to lead you. I will be your God. And so they were still under that covenant. And so in that sense, it helps me to understand, that those kids were not just being unkind to a man. They were being unkind to God because God spoke through his prophets. Like Elisha was the representation of God. And it's completely different from what we view pastors as today. Like when there's so many pastors everywhere. When I see a pastor, I'm not like, oh, this is the man of God. Like he like sees God and God speaks through him. Yeah, God speaks through him, but he's not like the man of God. Like Elisha was the man of God in the whole country. So it's a completely different dynamic. So for you to make fun of someone like that, it's almost as if you're really making fun of God. And that's where those kids went wrong.
And that's now where we have to talk about reverence because, this is now kindness towards God or respect towards God. We call that reverence. And I think that was something that the kids were lacking, obviously. I was just reminded, man, angels, we see that the Bible tells us that they veil their faces when they talk about God, right? So they have a huge respect, and those are angels. And now you have humans, not only back then, but also today, they make fun of God. They not only make fun of God, they make fun of God's people. They say, oh, Jesus will not come back. Jesus come, like what you said with 1844, man. That was exactly the case back then. And I believe it will also be the case shortly before Jesus comes back. You have that missing reverence, and that is also important to consider because if we miss that, man, we are not pleasing God. That's for sure.
So, I think what this discussion has helped me to see is that there's no definitive answer that I can give anyone outside of myself about this situation because it's 2 verses. Like, we don't know anything about these kids. We don't know anything about we just know that these kids died, right? But at the end of the day, we do have some tools that can help us understand and unpack it. So for one, we know that the Israelites were living in a theocracy. So God was their king, judge, jury, executioner. And we know that God is just. And so because he's just, we know that he executed judgment in a way that was not only just, but fair and gracious. Another tool that I use to unpack this story is the fact that Elisha was the representation of God. So it's not like me talking back to my pastor and being struck down by lightning, or me like opposing the president and getting struck down by lightning. Those are 2 different things, right? So for those that are tempted to say, well, that's the same thing as someone, just killing a political opponent or religious opponent, it's slightly different.
Yeah.
So those tools kind of help me to unpack a little bit. It doesn't give me the complete answer because I'm not God, but it helps me to understand that it gives me enough to hang my faith on to know that, okay, God knew what he was doing, and he has a reason for why he allowed that to happen.
That's right. Wrapping up, I also believe that the context is very important when we look at a story like that because especially we just have 2 verses, so we have to look at the verses before. I was mentioning that Elijah's ministry was happening just before that, and Elisha had this huge plan by God basically to continue the ministry, and people did not really trust him that much. We see that in the verses before when the Bible talks about the sons of the prophets. Even those people who were religious, who were following God, they didn't trust Elisha the same way they trusted Elijah. So that's important to consider. And so it was all a matter of respect, and we know that when we read the following chapters that Elisha was never ridiculed again. He was never being made fun of. That never happened again. So it was like God was just miraculously intervening for one moment to ensure that the ministry of his prophet would be successful. This event was also important because God stepped in to prevent the greater disaster. We don't know what these kids would have done or could have done if God had allowed them to live longer. But we know that many times in history, God stepped in or steps in to prevent the greater evil.
It's important to remember that the context of this story and many of the strange stories that Vincent and I are going to go through are very different than the context that we live in today. But the one thing that doesn't change is God. His character is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. is full of grace, mercy, and justice. And even through these bizarre stories, we believe that his character of love still shines through. Hey, if you want to listen to more episodes, subscribe on YouTube by searching for 21st Talks. That's 21ST Talks on YouTube. And when you click on any one of our videos, make sure to click on the subscribe button and the little bell on the bottom so you can get notified every time we release a new episode. Also, make sure to follow us on Spotify or whatever platform you use to listen to podcasts. And most importantly, send us a message on our Facebook page at facebook.com/21sttalks or anchor.fm/21sttalks to say hello and let us know what topics you'd like to hear Vince and I discuss.
And if you want to help us share these messages with more people, your small monthly donation on anchor.fm/21sttalks would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, and God bless.